right, so we are back and ready for a deep dive. And today we are tackling something that affects every single one of us. Cognitive errors, those little mental hiccups that trip us up in our thinking. And for this deep dive, we're going to be using Rolf Dobelli's book, The Art of Thinking, clearly as our guide.
Yeah, Dobelli's book is packed with insights into these fascinating and often predictable errors in our thinking. He calls them systematic deviations from logic, meaning it's not just about making the occasional bad decision, but rather about recognizing the recurring patterns in our thinking that can lead us astray.
And I think that is what makes this so interesting, because if we know the patterns, then maybe we can avoid the errors. So let's jump right in. The first one we are going to discuss is survivorship bias. Have you ever felt intimidated by all those successful people you see out there? Like every author is a bestseller, every entrepreneur is a millionaire.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that's something we all struggle with, and it's a classic example of survivorship bias in action. We only see the winners, right? We don't see the countless others who tried and didn't make it.
It's like we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. Dobelli actually uses a great analogy. He compares it to looking at a graveyard. We see all these impressive headstones, but we don't see all the people who never even made it to the cemetery.
Whoa, that's kind of morbid, but also very true. So how do we fight this survivorship bias then?
Well, Dobelli suggests that we need to be the ones digging in the graveyards of the unsuccessful. In a manner of speaking, we need to actively seek out the stories of those who failed to learn from their mistakes and to get a more realistic picture of the odds of success.
So next time you're feeling intimidated by someone's amazing success story, remember there's probably a whole lot more to the story that you're not seeing.
Right. You're only getting a very selective, very biased view.
All right, next up, we have the swimmer's body illusion. This one's a bit sneaky because it tricks us into chasing outcomes that might be more about selection than achievement.
Yes. It's like assuming that all Harvard grads are brilliant because of the school and not because they were already brilliant going in.
Right, it's confusing correlation with causation.
Exactly. We see those super fit models in ads and think, if I buy that product, I'll look like that. But those models were probably chosen for their looks, not because of the product itself.
Ah, so we're attributing the results to the wrong cause.
Exactly. And this illusion isn't just limited to fitness products, it's everywhere.
So it's about remembering to look beyond the surface and consider the selection process at play before we jump to any conclusions.
Precisely. Now let's move on to the clustering illusion. This one's about our brain's love for finding patterns even when they're not really there.
Oh, I'm definitely guilty of this one. Sometimes I see shapes in the clouds or hear hidden messages in songs.
That's a common example, right? Our brains are wired to seek out patterns. It was essential for survival in the past.
Right, like recognizing the tracks of a predator or the signs of an approaching storm.
Exactly. But this same tendency can lead us astray when we start seeing patterns where none exist.
Dobelli has this great example in his book about a Swedish opera singer who became convinced that he was talking to his dead mother through birdsong recordings.
It's a reminder that sometimes our desire for meaning can lead us to see connections where there are none.
Okay, this next one feels super relevant to today's world social proof.
It's the idea that we look to others to guide our actions, especially in uncertain situations. It's a powerful force, and it was helpful for survival in the past, but today it can be a double-edged sword.
Yeah. I mean, think about how much we rely on online reviews or social media trends to make decisions. It's like we're outsourcing our thinking to the crowd.
Absolutely. And while there's nothing wrong with considering the opinions of others, we need to be aware of how easily we can be swayed by the crowd, even when the crowd might be wrong.
Right. It's like those situations where everyone's looking up at the sky and you can't help but look up too, even if you have no idea what you're supposed to be seeing.
Exactly. It's a primal instinct. But we need to remember that just because everyone's doing something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do.
Dobelli uses the example of canned laughter in sitcoms as a subtle form of social proof.
It's designed to make us laugh along, even if the joke isn't actually that funny, and it works.
Wow, that's so sneaky. I never really thought about it that way. And in more extreme cases like Nazi Germany, social proof shows how crowds can be swayed to support dangerous ideas.
It's a chilling reminder of how powerful social influence can be and how important it is to think critically, even when it feels uncomfortable to go against the grain.
Okay, let's shift gears now to a bias that can trap us in bad decisions. The sunk cost fallacy.
This is about clinging to something just because we've already invested so much in it, whether that's time, money, or effort.
It's that feeling of, I can't give up. Now I've come too far.
Exactly. Even if all signs point to cutting our losses, we feel like we need to keep going just to justify our past investments.
I think we've all been there at some point.
Yeah.
Like sticking with a failing business venture or staying in a bad relationship just because we've already put in so much.
It's a trap, and the more we invest, the harder it becomes to let go, even when logic tells us we should.
So how do we avoid falling into this trap?
It's about recognizing that past investments are sunk costs. They're gone, and they shouldn't factor into our future decisions.
So we need to focus on the present and the future, not dwell on the past.
Exactly. We need to evaluate our decisions based on their potential future payoff, not on how much we've already sunk into them.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about being more objective and less emotional in our decision-making.
Now let's move on to the reciprocity principle. This one's about our tendency to feel obligated to return a favor, even if we didn't ask for it in the first place.
Oh yeah, like when someone buys you a coffee and then you feel pressured to buy them one back, even if you weren't really planning on having another coffee.
Exactly. Or when a supplier takes you to a fancy sporting event and you feel obligated to give them your business later, even if they're not the best option.
It's like this unspoken rule of social exchange. It can be hard to resist.
Absolutely. Dobelli calls it a form of gentle blackmail, and it's surprisingly effective.
So how do we navigate this without appearing rude or ungrateful?
Well, it's about being aware of the dynamic and making conscious decisions about when to reciprocate and when to politely decline.
Okay, let's talk about confirmation bias. This one's about our tendency to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs.
And we conveniently ignore anything that challenges our views. It's like we're building these echo chambers around ourselves.
Yeah, we're all guilty of this to some extent, right? It's just human nature to want to be right and to feel comfortable in our own beliefs.
Absolutely. But this tendency can lead to some real problems. It can prevent us from learning new things, from considering alternative perspectives, and from making sound decisions.
Even Warren Buffett, one of the most successful investors of all time, actively fights against confirmation bias.
He knows that facts don't cease to exist just because we ignore them. He's constantly seeking out information that challenges his own assumptions.
It's a reminder that we need to be open-minded, humble, and willing to change our minds when presented with new evidence.
Now let's talk about the contrast effect. This is about how our perceptions are influenced by comparisons.
It's like that trick clothing stores use, putting a high anchor price next to a lower one to make it seem like a steal.
That lower price might still be overpriced, but the contrast makes it seem more appealing.
It's all about framing.
And we need to be aware of these framing techniques so that we can make decisions based on the actual value of things, not on how they're presented to us.
Okay, next is availability bias. This one's about how we judge the likelihood of something happening based on how easily examples come to mind.
Like being terrified of flying because we can vividly recall images of plane crashes from the news.
Even though statistically flying is much safer than driving.
Exactly. We tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are dramatic, memorable, or emotionally charged.
So our perceptions of risk are often skewed by our emotional responses.
Dobelli says we think dramatically, not quantitatively. And I think that's a great way to put it.
Okay, and finally we have the story bias. This one's about how our brains crave narratives. We try to make sense of the world by creating stories, even if those stories oversimplify reality.
It's like we're constantly trying to fit the pieces of our lives into a coherent narrative, even if it means forcing them to fit where they don't belong.
Right. And this can lead to some serious distortions in how we remember events and how we make decisions.
Dobelli suggests a really interesting exercise to combat this bias. He recommends reading old diaries and newspapers to get a more objective view of the past and to see how events that seem so connected in hindsight weren't necessarily seen that way at the time.
That's a great idea. It's a way to break free from the tyranny of our own narratives and to see things from a fresh perspective.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the stories we tell ourselves are just that, stories. They're not always an accurate reflection of reality.
So it's about being more mindful of how we construct our own narratives and being open to alternative interpretations.
Absolutely. Now, we've covered a lot of ground here, but we've only just scratched the surface of the many cognitive errors that Dobelli explores in his book. And to be willing to change our minds when presented with new evidence.
Which can be tough sometimes, especially when we've invested a lot in a particular belief.
Absolutely. But it's essential for growth and for making sound decisions.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different biases and how they can trip us up.
Yeah.
But what can we actually do about it? How can we overcome these hardwired tendencies to make irrational decisions?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Well, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that we'll never be perfectly rational. We're human beings, not robots. We're always going to be influenced by our emotions, our biases, and our past experiences.
So it's not about achieving some kind of perfect state of rationality.
Right. It's more about awareness and mitigation. The more we understand these cognitive errors, the more we can start to recognize them in our own thinking and behavior.
It's like having a mental checklist of potential pitfalls.
Exactly. And when we're faced with an important decision, we can consult our list and ask ourselves, am I falling for any of these biases?
That makes sense. It's about being more mindful and deliberate in our decision-making.
Absolutely. Now, one specific technique that Dobelli recommends is keeping a decision journal.
Oh, that's interesting. How did that work?
It's pretty simple. Whenever you're faced with a significant decision, write down your prediction of what you think will happen. And then later on, once the outcome is clear, go back and compare your prediction to reality.
So you're basically tracking your own accuracy.
Exactly. And over time, you'll start to see patterns. You'll see which biases you're most susceptible to and in what situations you're most likely to make irrational decisions.
That's such a great idea. It's like holding yourself accountable for your own thought processes.
Right. It's a way to turn these abstract concepts into concrete data that you can use to improve your decision-making.
Okay, so awareness and a decision journal are two key tools. But are there other things we can do?
Absolutely. Another important strategy is to actively seek out diverse perspectives.
Right? Don't just surround yourself with people who agree with you all the time.
Challenge your own assumptions by talking to people who have different backgrounds, different beliefs, and different ways of seeing the world.
It's about expanding your horizons and breaking out of your own echo chamber.
And it's not always easy. It can be uncomfortable to have your beliefs challenged, but it's essential for growth and for making sound decisions.
And I think it's also important to remember that we're all in this together. We all have these biases, part of what makes us human.
Absolutely. So let's not be too hard on ourselves when we make mistakes. Let's just try to learn from them and move forward.
Right. It's a journey, not a destination.
Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on one more point that I think is really important. And that's the idea that not all cognitive errors are necessarily bad. Well, some of these biases that we've been talking about can actually be beneficial in certain situations. It all depends on the context.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Take the overconfidence bias, for instance. It can lead people to overestimate their abilities and make risky decisions.
Which can obviously have negative consequences.
Right. But on the flip side, overconfidence can also be a powerful motivator. It can give people the courage to pursue ambitious goals and to persevere in the face of obstacles.
So it's like a double-edged sword. It can cut both ways.
Exactly. And the same goes for other biases, like the sunk cost fallacy or the availability heuristic. They can lead to bad decisions in some cases, but they can also be helpful in others.
So it's all about understanding the nuances of these biases and recognizing when they might be working for us rather than against us.
Absolutely. It's about developing a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of how our minds work. It's about recognizing that our thinking is not always perfectly rational, but that doesn't mean it's always wrong or useless.
I love that perspective. It's about embracing our imperfections and learning to work with them rather than against them.
And that's really the key takeaway from Dobelli's book. It's not about striving for some unattainable ideal of perfect rationality. It's about recognizing our cognitive limitations and developing strategies to mitigate their negative effects.
It's about being more mindful, more deliberate, and more compassionate with ourselves.
Absolutely. And it's a journey that we're all on together. So let's keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving to make better decisions.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive into the art of thinking clearly. It's really made me think about how my own mind works and how I can make better decisions in all areas of my life.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and we hope you've gained some valuable insights as well. Remember, thinking clearly is a skill that can be developed and refined with practice.
And remember, even though our minds are flawed, they're also capable of amazing things. Happy thinking.